Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we plunge headfirst into a world of medieval machinations, where courtly love twisted into political poison, and a queen's fury was a weapon more potent than any sword. You're not just listening to a story, you're standing right there in the dusty, echoing halls of a 14th century English castle. The air is thick with the scent of roasted meat and unwashed bodies. The murmur of 1,000 servants and schemers is a constant hum in the background, and every shadow seems to hide a dagger. This is a place where your best friend could become your greatest enemy, a place where a single misstep could cost you everything. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is, and we can start this journey together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine yourself a silent observer, a ghost in the hallowed halls of Westminster Palace. The year is 1307. The air still buzzes with the recent death of King Edward I, the formidable Hammer of the Scots. His son, Edward II, now sits on the throne, but unlike his stern, battle-hardened father, the new king is different. He's more interested in poetry, in music, in the arts. He's more interested in men, to be frank, and in one man in particular. That man is Piers Gaveston. You see him now. A flash of silk, a ripple of laughter. He's tall, athletic, with a quick wit and a charming smirk that seems to melt the king's rigid defences. Gaveston is not English by birth. He's from Gascony, a region of southwestern France that was at the time under English control. His father, a loyal knight, had sent him to serve in the household of the future king. Young Edward and Piers were raised together, two boys in a royal nursery, and a bond formed between them that was to shape the fate of a kingdom. Historians still argue whether their relationship was a platonic friendship of extraordinary intensity, or a romantic and physical one. But what's clear is that it was a love affair of some kind, a deep and consuming attachment that defined Edward's reign from its first day. The king lavishes Gaveston with attention and titles. He makes him Earl of Cornwall, a title previously reserved for members of the royal family. He marries him to Margaret de Clare, his own niece, and a woman with an inheritance so vast it's practically its own country. These aren't just gifts, they're acts of defiance. Edward is a king and he has a favourite. So what? But the English barons, the men who hold the real power, are not amused. They are men of land, of lineage, of war. They see Gaveston as an upstart foreigner, a social climbing interloper who has bewitched their king. This isn't just about a personal preference, it's about the very balance of power in England. You watch as Gaveston, emboldened by the king's affection, becomes increasingly arrogant. He starts calling the powerful nobles by cruel, mocking nicknames. He refers to the mighty Earl of Lancaster, the king's cousin, as churl, which is basically medieval speak for a common peasant. He calls the Earl of Pembroke Joseph the Jew, a deeply offensive and anti-Semitic slur that's an even more shocking jab given the era. This wasn't just playful banter, it was a calculated campaign of psychological warfare against the most powerful men in the kingdom, and it was bound to backfire. And where, you might ask, is the Queen in all this? Her name is Isabella, and she is the daughter of the King of France. She was brought to England as a symbol of peace, a young bride for a young king, but her wedding day was a sign of things to come. The king, Edward II, didn't even attend the ceremony in France. He sent his beloved Gaveston to represent him, and when Isabella finally arrived in England, he gave Gaveston all of the wedding gifts she had brought with her. Now she watches from the sidelines, a ghost at her own court, while the man who is supposed to be her husband openly prefers another. The mainstream historical fact here is that Edward's intense affection for Gaveston was a source of open scandal and political instability from the very beginning of his reign. The chroniclers of the day were obsessed with it, and it became a defining feature of the period. There's a quirky or fringe tidbit of history here that might surprise you. One account suggests that Gaveston was so flamboyant in his style that he'd decorate his clothing with jewels and ribbons in a way that was considered wildly effeminate for a knight. This wasn't just a fashion choice. In the rigid social hierarchy of the time, it was a subtle act of rebellion, a way of signalling his unique place in the king's affections. It just further infuriated the stiff formal nobles who believed that men should wear their armour and their grit on their sleeves, not shiny trinkets. So, as you stand in the shadows, you feel the tension building. It's not a thunderous clash of armies yet, but a subtle, creeping dread. The nobles whisper to each other in the corners of the hall, their faces grim. The queen sits in stony silence, her eyes following her husband and his favourite with a cold, calculating gaze. This isn't just a love triangle, it's the spark that will ignite a civil war. Edward, blind to the growing resentment, believes his love for Gaveston is a private affair, something that can't possibly threaten his throne. He is terribly, horribly wrong. You can see it in the way the nobles clutch the hilts of their swords, in the thin, tight line of the Queen's lips. The stage is set, the players are in place, and the first act of this brutal drama is just beginning. The heavy velvet curtains in the Queen's chamber feel like a shroud. You're there, a quiet observer, as Queen Isabella sits before a roaring fire, her delicate hands clenched into fists. She's not a girl anymore. She's a wife and a queen, and she's starting to feel the chill of neglect. When she arrived in England as a 12-year-old bride, she was a symbol of political hope, a living treaty between France and England. Now she's a forgotten footnote in her own marriage, eclipsed by the larger-than-life figure of Piers Gaveston. You can almost feel her quiet humiliation, the kind that eats at you from the inside out. Remember how we said Edward gave all of her wedding gifts to his friend? That wasn't just a snub. It was a public declaration of where her place was in the pecking order, somewhere below the king's favourite. The tension in the court isn't just about politics, it's personal. Gaveston, as we know, is arrogant. He's not just charming the king, he's actively mocking the queen and her retinue. There are whispers of him giving the queen's ladies-in-waiting crude nicknames and making jokes at her expense. This is a potent cocktail of insult and powerlessness, and it's turning a young woman's pride into a slow-burning rage. The mainstream historical fact here is that Queen Isabella's hostility towards Gaveston was well documented from the very beginning of her marriage. The chroniclers of the time make it clear that Gaveston's influence and open favouritism by the king created a deeply strained relationship between the royal couple, and that this was a major factor in the political unrest. It wasn't just a political alliance gone sour, it was a deeply personal slight that fueled her animosity. A peculiar tidbit from the annals of history suggests that Isabella once tried to confront Gaveston directly in the king's presence. She reportedly told him, with all the frostiness a young queen could muster, that his insolence would not go unpunished. Gaveston, in turn, is said to have merely laughed it off, secure in the knowledge of the king's protection. Imagine that scene. A young queen trying to assert her dignity, being openly mocked by her husband's paramour. This wasn't just a power struggle, it was an emotional and psychological war. Historians still argue whether this particular exchange happened exactly as it was recorded, but the sentiment behind it is widely accepted as true. It captures the essence of her growing resentment. The feeling of being completely dismissed by her own husband and his favourite was a poison that would eventually lead to tragedy for both of them. You see the queen now, a shadow of her former hopeful self. Her once vibrant French gowns seem a little too tight, her movements a little too stiff. She's not just a witness to her husband's indiscretions, she's a participant in her own political exile. While the king is off feasting and jousting with Gaveston, Isabella is left to cultivate her own alliances. Her father, the King of France, is not pleased with the treatment of his daughter. The French court is a powerful force, and Isabella knows how to play the long game. She begins to write letters, to send secret messengers. She's not asking for help, she's laying the groundwork for a future confrontation. It's a quiet, strategic sort of fury, a silent chess match where the pieces are kings, queens and barons. The barons, for their part, are circling like sharks. They see Gaveston not just as an annoyance, but as a direct threat to their power and wealth. They are men of immense landholdings and military might, and they believe the king's favour should be bestowed upon them, the rightful pillars of the kingdom. Gaveston's meteoric rise is an affront to the feudal system itself. They see a foreigner, a man with no inherited claim, being given titles and lands that they feel should have been theirs. This is where the Queen's personal animosity and the Baron's political grievances begin to align. The enemy of my enemy, as they say, is my friend. Isabella, with her quiet diplomacy, starts to make overtures to the very men who are most angered by her husband's behaviour. One day you see a secret meeting. It's not in the grand halls, but in a small private chapel, lit by flickering candlelight. The The powerful Earl of Lancaster, a stern, imposing man, is there. So is the Earl of Warwick, known as the Black Dog of Arden for his fierce temper. And there, in the midst of these hardened warriors, is the young queen. She's not a player yet, but she is a force. She doesn't have an army, but she has a powerful ally in her father, and she has the deep-seated rage of a woman scorned. This is the moment where the queen and the baron's separate motives become a single, unified purpose, to remove Piers Gaveston from power. The air is thick with plots and counterplots. The king, in his blissful oblivion, is planning another lavish tournament for his friend. The barons, in their cold fury, are planning something else entirely. They are drawing up a list of demands, a political document that will force the king's hand. And Isabella, the queen, is no longer the ignored girl in the corner. She's a silent partner in this conspiracy. She might not be swinging a sword, but she's sharpening the knives of those who will. The queen's quiet discontent has turned into a dangerous weapon, and you can sense that the first great confrontation of this reign is just on the horizon. The whispers of her anger have become a thunder that threatens to shake the very foundations of the throne. The court is a whirlwind of whispers and veiled glances, but King Edward II seems to live in a world of his own making, a world where the only person who truly matters is Piers Gaveston. You stand in the great hall, watching as Edward, with the easy grace of a man unburdened by the weight of his crown, leans in close to his favourite, a conspiratorial smile on his lips. The king's devotion is not just a personal quirk, it's a political statement. He has made it abundantly clear that Gaveston's counsel and company are more valuable to him than the advice of his most powerful nobles, and definitely more valuable than the peace of his kingdom. He grants Gaveston title after title, privilege after privilege. You see him bestow upon Gaveston the vast wealthy earldom of Cornwall, a staggering honour typically reserved for a prince. It's an act of magnificent, defiant love, a kind of look what I can do gesture to the angry men who surround him. The king's passion is so all-consuming that it blinds him to the very real danger brewing. The mainstream historical fact is that Edward II's steadfast refusal to listen to his barons about Gaveston's position was the primary cause of the political crisis that defined his early reign. The king's unshakable loyalty wasn't seen as a virtue but as a sign of his weakness and his unsuitability to rule. The nobles believed a king should be impartial, a shepherd to his flock, not a man so besotted with one person that he ignores the entire flock's pleas. It was a failure of duty, and they wouldn't stand for it. There's a quirky, almost absurd detail from this period that highlights the king's obsession. Edward II, for all his love of jousting and physical activities, had a peculiar fascination with digging ditches and thatching roofs. He had a strange desire to perform the labour of commoners. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine interest in manual labour or a further act of rebellion against the strict, formalised role of a king. It might seem like a harmless hobby, but in a world where every action was scrutinised for its political meaning, it was just another sign to the barons that their king was, well, a bit weird and not cut out for the serious business of ruling. You see the tension play out in small, intimate moments. The king is holding a falconry display, a moment of fleeting peace. But even here, Gaveston, with his easy laugh and privileged position at the king's side, is a source of friction. The Earl of Warwick, the Black Dog, is a man of grim determination. He stands apart, his face a mask of stone as he watches the king's indulgence. He sees Gaveston not as a man, but as a pest, an interloper who must be removed. These moments of quiet rage are more terrifying than any open brawl. They are the simmering cauldron that will eventually boil over. The king's actions aren't just annoying the nobles, they're creating a power vacuum. With Gaveston as the de facto First Minister, the traditional offices of the crown are being ignored. There's a widespread feeling that the kingdom is being run not by a stable government, but by the whims of a single frivolous man. And so, the murmurs of discontent begin to take a more organised shape. You hear the whispers of a plan. The barons are not just going to complain anymore, they're going to act. They start to talk about a formal banishment. They'll force the king to send Gaveston away. It's a bold move, a challenge to the royal prerogative itself. Edward, of course, is completely unaware of the depth of the opposition. He believes his love can conquer all. He throws lavish parties, organises tournaments, and piles more and more gifts upon Gaveston, as if he can buy their acceptance. One of the more extravagant gifts was the royal regalia of the late king, his father. a particularly egregious move, as it stripped the heir, the future Edward III, of his birthright. This was not just a gift, but a power play, an attempt to elevate Gaveston to an almost royal status. The nobles are seething. How dare this upstart wear the jewels of a king? How dare he sit at the king's right hand and call the great men of the kingdom by childish, insulting names? The Queen, remember her. She's watching all of this with a cold, calculating eye. She sees her husband's love not as a strength, but as a weakness to be exploited. She sees the nobles' rage not as a threat, but as an opportunity. She knows that Gaveston is the linchpin, the one thing holding the entire court together, and also the one thing that can shatter it completely. She's a chess player and she sees how the board is being set. She's waiting for the perfect moment to make her move. So, as the king and his favourite laugh and joust and feast, the shadows grow longer in the palace halls. The barons, led by the king's own cousin, the Earl of Lancaster, are making their demands. They are not asking for a favour, they are giving an order. And the king, in his stubborn devotion, is about to face a choice, his crown or his companion. He will soon learn that in the world of power politics, love is a liability, and loyalty is often a one-way street. The easy days are over, and the stage is now set for a confrontation that will send shockwaves through the kingdom. The whispers in the great hall have finally become a roar. The nobles, fed up with Gaveston's arrogance and the king's blind devotion, have made their move. You're standing in the midst of it all, a silent witness to a scene of high drama. The barons, an intimidating phalanx of powerful men in heavy wool and glinting steel, confront the king directly. It's not a negotiation, it's a non-negotiable demand. Gaveston must be banished. They present Edward with a formal document, a decree that reads like a political death sentence for his favourite. It's a shocking display of power, a direct challenge to the king's authority, and it leaves Edward sputtering with rage and disbelief. The mainstream historical fact is that in 1308, after a year of rising tensions, the barons forced Edward II to agree to the exile of Piers Gaveston. This was not a suggestion. It was a condition for the continued political stability of the kingdom. The barons made it clear that if the king did not comply, they would rise up against him. It was a humiliating moment for Edward, a stark reminder that his personal desires were secondary to the will of the powerful men who held the kingdom's purse strings and armies. The king, cornered and with no other option, had to relent. Edward, in a fit of grief and anger, agrees to the banishment, but he's not giving up. He's simply playing a different game. He sends Gaveston not to a desolate, far-flung land, but to Dublin, in Ireland. And he doesn't just send him as an exile. He makes him the king's lieutenant, the ruler of Ireland. It's a move of breathtaking cheek. It's the equivalent of telling your family you've grounded your rebellious teenager, but then giving them the keys to a sports car and their own penthouse apartment a few blocks away. Edward is publicly obeying the barons' command, but privately he is thumbing his nose at them. You can almost feel the barons' frustration. They have won a battle, but the war is far from over. They wanted Gaveston gone, out of the picture, stripped of his power. Instead, he's been given a new kingdom and a new title. It's a temporary solution to a permanent problem. Gaveston, in Dublin, is surprisingly effective. He puts down a rebellion and governs with a firm hand. It's a quirky tidbit of history that shows Gaveston wasn't just a dandy or a court favourite. He had genuine administrative and military talent. It's a fact that must have only made the barons more furious. Not only did he refuse to be a powerless exile, but he was succeeding, proving himself a worthy man in a role they would never have allowed him in England. Meanwhile, back in England, the king is miserable. He's like a lost puppy wandering the halls without his companion. The court is a grim place, filled with silence and suppressed anger. Edward pines for Gaveston, writing him long, mournful letters. The king's devotion is so absolute that it transcends mere physical proximity. He's a king, but he's acting like a lovesick teenager. His neglect of his royal duties becomes even more pronounced. He's listless, uninterested in the affairs of state. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate act to show the barons how much he needed Gaveston, or a genuine emotional collapse. Either way, it was a political disaster. Isabella, the Queen, is watching all of this with a grim satisfaction. She's no longer just a wronged wife. She is a political opportunist. She sees how the king's grief is weakening his position, and she is playing a subtle game, building her own network of alliances. She is the Queen, after all, and she is French. She knows the politics of power better than her own husband does. She's cultivating her own power base, making herself indispensable to some of the very nobles who despised her. You can see the inevitability of what's to come. Edward is too devoted to Gaveston to ever truly let him go. The barons are too powerful to allow him to return. The stage is set for a clash, and sure enough, after less than a year, the king finds a pretext to bring his friend back. He claims that Gaveston has been an exemplary lieutenant and that his exile was unjust. He appeals to a group of bishops and nobles who are more sympathetic to his plight, and with their shaky approval, he recalls Gaveston. The return is a moment of pure, reckless joy for the king. You see Gaveston ride back into London greeted by a jubilant Edward who showers him with gifts and embraces him in front of the entire court. It is a moment of pure spectacle, a public slap in the face to the barons. The barons, of course, are furious. The Black Dog of Warwick reportedly says he has been called home and he shall not escape us again. This isn't just a political disagreement anymore. It's personal. It's a contest of wills between a besotted king and his enraged nobles, and this time there will be no easy solution, no political compromise. The next move in this dangerous game will be a far more permanent one. You can almost feel the collective intake of breath from the noble families across England. Gaveston is back. The news travels like wildfire, carried by couriers on swift horses and whispered in the cold, stone halls of every castle. The king's blatant disregard for their decree has turned simmering resentment into a white-hot fury. The forced exile was meant to be a permanent solution, a line in the sand. Edward's bringing Gaveston back was not just a crossing of that line, it was a defiant, joyful stomp all over it. The barons, the men who held the real power in the kingdom, are now united by a singular burning goal: vengeance. The mainstream historical fact is that Piers Gaveston's return from exile was the final straw for many of the most powerful English barons, leading them to form a formal alliance known as the Lords Ordainers. They were a formidable group, including the powerful Earl of Lancaster, the king's own cousin, the Earl of Warwick, a man known for his brutality, the Earl of Arundel, and a host of other magnates who controlled vast swathes of the country and their own private armies. This wasn't a loose coalition. It was a sworn oath to enforce their will on the king, with or without his cooperation. They were no longer just asking. They were preparing for war. You can sense the change in the atmosphere. The court is now a place of open hostility. The feasting and jousting of the past are replaced by tense silence and averted gazes. The barons have stopped showing up to court. They're meeting in secret, in remote fortresses, in the privacy of their own castles, where they can speak their minds without fear of the king's eavesdroppers. They're no longer content with simply banishing Gaveston. Their goal is more ambitious now. They want to strip the king of his power. They want to create a political system where the king is subject to the will of the nobles, where he can't simply rule as he pleases, guided by the whispers of his favourite. This isn't just about Piers Gaveston anymore. It's about the very nature of kingship in England. There's a quirky tidbit from this time that shows the depth of the barons' animosity. The Earl of Warwick, the Black Dog, reportedly swore a personal oath that Gaveston would feel the power of the wolf's tooth. The wolf, in this case, was his own family emblem. It was a dark, poetic threat, a promise of a hunt that would end in a brutal death. It wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a blood feud, a deeply personal vendetta that drove these powerful men to act with a terrifying finality. Historians still argue whether Warwick's promise was truly a public statement or a whispered threat, but what's clear is that the sentiment of vengeful intent was widespread among the barons. You can feel the paranoia creeping into the court. Edward II is now surrounded by men he can't trust. He starts to rely on a few loyalists, but their numbers are small. He's in a trap of his own making, a king isolated from the very men who can hold his kingdom together. Gaveston, surprisingly, seems to be enjoying the new level of tension. He's more arrogant than ever, as if the danger simply confirms his special status. He sees himself as a martyr to the king's love, a noble victim of base jealousy. This blindness to his own peril is perhaps his most fatal flaw. He believes the king's love is a shield impenetrable to all harm. And where is the Queen in all of this? Isabella is not just a passive observer anymore. She's an active player. She has carefully cultivated her relationships with some of the more moderate barons, presenting herself as a voice of reason, a queen who wants to see the kingdom whole and stable. She's not openly plotting for Gaveston's death. Not yet, but she is encouraging the discontent. She sees the barons' anger as her own ticket to power. If they can force the king to accept their will, then she, as a part of their alliance, will also be elevated. The enemy of my enemy, indeed. The barons' alliance takes a formal shape. They write a new document, the Ordinances, a series of sweeping reforms that would essentially place the king under the control of a noble council. They're demanding the right to approve all royal appointments, control the treasury, and, of course, exile Piers Gaveston once and for all, this time under pain of death. They are not just asking for a temporary banishment, they are asking for his head. This is the new reality. Edward has pushed them too far, and their response is swift and brutal. You can almost hear the trumpets of war sounding in the distance. The barons are raising their armies, their banners flying in the wind. This is no longer a courtly drama. It's the prelude to a civil war. Edward, in his stubbornness, is about to learn that a king's love is a fragile thing, and that the vengeance of a wronged nobleman is a force of nature. The alliance is set, the demands are made, and the storm is about to break. The air in the chamber is heavy with a tension so thick you could carve it with a knife. You are there, standing in the hushed gallery, as the full might of the English baronage faces off against their king. This is not a casual meeting, this is a reckoning. The occasion is a session of Parliament, but it has the feel of a siege. The powerful magnates, their faces grim and set, are arrayed before Edward II. They are not just men, they are the living embodiments of the land, the armies, and the wealth of England, and they have come to force their will upon a king who has forgotten his place. The mainstream historical fact is that in 1311, the Lords Ordainers presented King Edward II with the Ordinances, a radical document of 41 articles that fundamentally sought to reform the government and limit royal power. This was a direct constitutional challenge to the monarch, an attempt to make the king subject to the will of the magnates. The Ordinances were sweeping in their scope, demanding the banishment of Piers Gaveston, placing royal appointments under parliamentary control, and even requiring the king to get permission from Parliament to declare war. It was a complete overhaul of the government, and it was all aimed at reining in a king who had proven himself unfit to rule without a powerful hand guiding him. You can see the king's face, a mask of fury and humiliation. He is not a man to be told what to do, especially not by his own subjects. He sees the Ordinances not as a path to good governance, but as a blatant power grab, a final, public insult to his royal dignity. He knows that agreeing to these terms would make him a puppet king, a figurehead whose every move is dictated by the very men he despises. He wants to refuse, to shout them down, to dismiss them all as traitors. But he can't. The barons have come with their armies close at hand, a silent but very real threat. He is politically isolated, his only true ally being the man whose presence has caused this entire confrontation. There's a quirky tidbit from the annals of the period that reveals the king's state of mind. During the debate, Edward reportedly flew into a rage and started to physically tear at the document, screaming that he was the anointed king and no one had the right to tell him what to do. Of course, he couldn't actually destroy the document. There were dozens of copies, but the act itself, a tantrum of a king, shows just how deeply this challenge wounded his pride. Historians still argue about the exact words he used, but the spirit of his fury is well documented. The Queen, Isabella, is a silent presence in the room. She's a fascinating study in political calculation. She doesn't speak, she doesn't openly cheer on the barons. But you see her eyes, watching the king, watching the nobles, her gaze cool and appraising. She knows that this is a pivotal moment, a turning point. She has played her part in encouraging the discontent, and now she's reaping the benefits. She's no longer the sidelined foreign queen. She's a queen with powerful allies, a queen whose influence is growing every single day. She understands that the Ordinances, while primarily aimed at Gaveston, also serve to weaken her husband, thereby strengthening her own position. The barons are merciless in their prosecution of the Ordinances. They are methodical and relentless, ticking off each article, forcing the king to listen to every single word. The most damning, of course, is Article 20, which demands the banishment of Gaveston for the second time, but this time with a far more serious threat. If he returns to England, he will be considered an outlaw. The word outlaw, in medieval times, was a terrifying pronouncement. It meant a man could be killed by anyone, with no legal recourse, no trial, no justice. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. The king, with no military support and facing a unified front of his most powerful subjects, has no choice but to concede. He swallows his pride and agrees to sign the ordinances. It is the most humiliating moment of his reign. He has been outmanoeuvred, outwitted, and publicly shamed. The barons have won. They have forced their will on their king, and they have, for the second time, forced him to send away the man he loves most. But this time, the banishment feels different. It feels final. As Gaveston prepares to leave, you can see the despair on the king's face. He knows what outlaw means. He knows that his friend is leaving not for a temporary exile, but for a journey into the political wilderness, a place where he can be hunted down and killed by the very men who now hold the reins of power. The barons have gotten what they wanted, but they are not done yet. The victory feels incomplete. They have not yet seen the ultimate consequence of their will. They have not yet tasted the satisfaction of knowing that the upstart foreigner will never, ever trouble the realm again. The king's signature on the ordinances is still fresh, the ink a dark stain on the parchment and on his royal dignity. You feel the silence in the chamber, the weight of a defeat that is more profound than any loss on a battlefield. But as the nobles disperse, their mission accomplished, you see a subtle change in Queen Isabella. She's been a quiet presence, a demure wife, and a silent observer. Now you sense her political manoeuvring shift into a higher gear. This isn't just about Piers Gaveston anymore, it's about power. And she has realised, with a chilling clarity, that the barons are not just her husband's enemies, they are her new allies. The king's weakness has become her strength. The mainstream historical fact here is that Queen Isabella actively sided with the Lords Ordainers against her husband. She didn't just stand by, she lent her considerable influence to their cause. Her loyalty to her husband, once a defining feature of her public persona, evaporated under the relentless slights and humiliations she had endured. She became a key player in the anti-Gaveston faction, seeing the removal of the favourite as a necessary first step to restoring her own position at court, and ultimately to gaining more influence over her husband's reign. Her betrayal was calculated and cold, a response to years of being overlooked and dismissed. You can almost see the gears turning in her mind. She's not acting out of a simple need for revenge. She's a French princess, after all, and her upbringing in the most politically astute court in Europe has taught her the true nature of power. She knows that a king who is a slave to his passions is a king who will lose his throne. She sees her husband's refusal to abandon Gaveston not as a sign of his loyalty, but as a sign of his fatal flaw. She has to protect the kingdom, protect her son, the future king, Edward III, and protect herself. She can't do that if her husband is making the kingdom's decisions based on what makes his favourite happy. There's a quirky tidbit from the Chronicles that shows the chilling nature of her betrayal. While the king was grieving the departure of his friend, Isabella reportedly started to host private dinners for the more moderate barons, those who had been instrumental in forcing the ordinances. At these gatherings, she would speak of her own suffering under Gaveston's influence, painting a picture of a wronged wife and a suffering queen. She would even reportedly give them gifts, small but significant tokens, as a way of cementing their loyalty to her, not to the king. This was not a random act of kindness. It was a political masterstroke, a way of building her own faction right under her husband's nose. Historians still argue about the extent of her early plotting, but it's widely believed that she was actively building her own power base long before the final confrontation. You witness the subtle, day-to-day shifts in the court. The Queen's chambers, once quiet and lonely, are now bustling with activity. Messengers come and go. She's receiving visitors from the most powerful noble houses. She's not just a political figurehead. She's now a hub of influence, a silent centre of gravity for the anti-Gaveston movement. She's playing a game of quiet diplomacy, a stark contrast to her husband's loud, reckless defiance. She's a master of the double game, publicly playing the part of the devoted, heartbroken wife, while privately aligning herself with her husband's enemies. Her strategy is brilliant in its simplicity. She uses her position as queen, as the mother of the heir, to legitimise the barons' actions. She frames their demands not as a challenge to the monarchy, but as a desperate measure to save it from her husband's ruinous affection for a commoner. She understands that the barons, for all their power, need a public face of legitimacy, a reason for their actions that goes beyond simple greed and jealousy. She is that face. She is the wronged queen, the embodiment of a kingdom betrayed by its own ruler. The king, in his grief, seems completely oblivious to this. He's so focused on his own sorrow and his desire to bring Gaveston back that he fails to see the political web being woven around him. He sees his wife's support for the ordinances as a temporary alignment of convenience, not as a permanent political realignment. He's about to find out that when a queen with a grievance and a genius for politics finally decides to play her hand, the consequences can be catastrophic. The stage is set for a climax, and the queen's calculated betrayal is the final act that will seal Piers Gaveston's fate. She's not just an angry wife anymore, she is the mastermind of a royal coup. The king's surrender at Parliament has set the stage for a desperate final act. The moment the ink was dry on the ordinances, Piers Gaveston knew his life was in jeopardy. The word outlaw was a death sentence, a horrifying license for any man with a grudge and a sword to take his life with impunity. He can no longer simply walk through the streets of London or reside comfortably in a royal palace. The kingdom is no longer his sanctuary. It is a hunting ground, and he is the prey. You witness his hurried departure from London. It's not the grand procession of his first exile. This time there's no fanfare, no cheering crowds, and no defiant king to grant him new titles. He is a man on the run, his entourage a small band of loyalists and hired mercenaries. The king, heartbroken but powerless, has arranged for him to flee to the north, a place he believes to be more sympathetic to the crown. It's a desperate gamble. Gaveston's flight is not just from the barons, but from a sentence that hangs over his head like the sword of Damocles. The mainstream historical fact is that after the ordinances were signed, Piers Gaveston fled to his last remaining stronghold, Scarborough Castle on the coast of Yorkshire. He didn't flee abroad as he did before because he knew the barons would be watching the ports, and he also likely held out hope that the king would somehow come to his rescue. This retreat to a formidable fortress was a strategic move, a final attempt to survive long enough for Edward to muster his forces and come to his aid. As you follow his trail, you see the tension and the fear. Gaveston, once so confident and arrogant, is a man now humbled by a very real, very mortal fear. He rides through the countryside, always on the lookout for a baron's banner, a sight that would mean instant death. The game of cat and mouse has begun, but this time the cat is a coalition of the most powerful men in England, and the mouse is utterly isolated. This is no longer a political dispute, it's a manhunt. There's a quirky detail from this period that speaks to the desperation of the moment. Gaveston, in his flight, reportedly took with him a small prize collection of jewels and fine silks, a curious choice for a man running for his life. It was as if he couldn't bear to part with the symbols of the life he was losing, a life of luxury and excess, a life of the king's favour. Historians still argue whether this was an act of vanity or a desperate attempt to hold on to a piece of his identity, but it's a telling detail that paints a picture of a man who, until the very end, believed his extravagant lifestyle was what defined him. Meanwhile, the barons are not standing still. The Earl of Lancaster, the powerful leader of the Lords Ordainers, is a man of grim resolve. He has sworn to see Gaveston exiled or dead. He knows that Gaveston's presence, even in a remote castle, is a threat to the fragile peace they have forced upon the kingdom. He orders his lieutenants, most notably the Earl of Pembroke and the Earl of Warwick, to pursue Gaveston with all haste. This is not just a royal hunt. It's a political assassination in the making, carried out by the very men who are sworn to uphold the law. You see the barons' forces, a formidable army of knights and men-at-arms, closing in on Scarborough. The siege is inevitable. Gaveston's last hope is that the castle's imposing walls and its location on a rocky promontory will give him enough time for the king to ride to his rescue. But Edward II is not his father, the Hammer of the Scots. He is not a great military commander. He is a king who is still grieving, still in a state of shock from his public humiliation, and he is surrounded by men who are secretly in league with his enemies. Gaveston's final stand is a moment of high drama. He retreats to the castle, its stone walls a temporary shield against the storm. He sends desperate messages to the king, begging for a rescue. He is a man cornered, a man who has gambled on the king's devotion, and is now finding out that even a king's love has its limits in the face of overwhelming political and military opposition. The siege of Scarborough Castle is about to begin, and it will be the final chapter in the story of Piers Gaveston. He's no longer the king's favourite. He's a man besieged, a man alone, facing a vengeful alliance that will not rest until his life is forfeit. The pounding of the waves against the cliffs below is a constant rhythmic drumbeat, but it's drowned out by the thunder of the siege engines. You're perched high on a misty hill overlooking Scarborough, a silent witness to a drama playing out on a grand scale. Scarborough Castle stands on a rocky headland, an imposing fortress designed to withstand a siege, a last hope for a man on the run. But the men besieging it are not a random band of mercenaries. They are the combined forces of the English baronage, led by the relentless Earls of Pembroke and Warwick. They are not here to negotiate. They are here for a single purpose: to capture Piers Gaveston, alive or dead. The mainstream historical fact is that in May 1312, the Baron's forces, led by the Earl of Pembroke, successfully besieged Scarborough Castle, the final refuge of Piers Gaveston. The castle itself was a formidable stronghold, but its isolated location meant that supplies were scarce, and it was virtually impossible to resupply a garrison under siege. Gaveston knew he was in a race against time, hoping the king would break the siege, but with a limited garrison and dwindling food, his position was untenable. You can see the desperation of the situation. Gaveston is trapped. The castle's walls are strong, its position strategic, but the men inside are few. He has no hope of a relief force from the king, who is either unwilling or unable to raise an army to come to his friend's aid. The king, remember, is still reeling from his political humiliation. His power has been curtailed, his will subverted, and he is a monarch in name only. The barons have him on a tight leash, and they have no intention of letting him go to the aid of the very man they are hunting. There's a quirky tidbit from the records of the siege that adds a human element to this story of high politics. It's said that during the initial days of the siege, Gaveston, in a fit of theatrical defiance, would stand on the battlements and taunt the besieging forces, insulting them and reminding them that he was the king's favourite. It was a final flamboyant display of the arrogance that had gotten him into this mess in the first place. Historians still argue whether this was a true act of bravado or a desperate bluff, but it paints a picture of a man who, even when cornered, couldn't help but play the role of the king's beloved. The siege is short but brutal. The barons' forces methodically set up their trebuchets and battering rams. They have a massive advantage in numbers and equipment. Gaveston, a capable military man in his own right, knows that resistance is futile. He could hold out for a while, but it would be a pointless exercise, one that would only lead to a bloodbath for his loyal men. So after a few weeks, he makes a decision. He sends a message to the Earl of Pembroke. He will surrender, but only to Pembroke, a man he hopes will be more merciful than the Black Dog of Warwick. He asks for a trial and promises to submit to the ordinances, the very document that had declared him an outlaw. Pembroke, for his part, agrees. He is a man of honour, and he is sworn to a code. He promises Gaveston that he will be taken to London, a city where he can face a legitimate trial and be brought before the king. He is a moderate among the barons, a man who believes in law and order, even for a man as despised as Gaveston. He makes a solemn oath, a vow on his own life and honour, that Gaveston will be safe with him. It's a moment of immense, chilling irony. Gaveston, in his final act of desperation, is trusting his life to the very men who are sworn to destroy him. As you watch Gaveston walk out of the castle, a captive in the hands of the very men he had once mocked, you feel the end drawing near. He is no longer the king's favourite, dressed in fine silks and jewels. He is a prisoner, his fate sealed by the choices he and his king had made. The siege is over. The barons have won the battle, but the war for Piers Gaveston's life, and for the soul of the English monarchy, is just beginning. The final act of this tragedy is about to be written, and it will be soaked in blood and betrayal. The journey south is a slow, agonising descent into despair. You're riding alongside the small, heavily guarded party, the clinking of chains and the soft thud of horse hooves the only sounds in the quiet countryside. Piers Gaveston is no longer the flamboyant courtier. He is a prisoner. His face is gaunt, his shoulders slumped, his once arrogant gaze now filled with a chilling mixture of fear and exhaustion. He is not being taken to London, as the Earl of Pembroke had promised. Instead, they are on a detour, a journey to the Earl of Pembroke's lands in the Midlands, a place where he can be held until his fate is decided. The mainstream historical fact is that after his surrender at Scarborough, Piers Gaveston was placed in the custody of the Earl of Pembroke. Pembroke, a moderate among the barons, believed in due process and had promised Gaveston that he would be taken to London to stand trial before the King and Parliament. However, while they were en route, Pembroke left Gaveston at the Manor of Deddington in Northamptonshire for a single night, confident in the safety of his ward. This seemingly minor decision would prove to be one of the most fateful moments in this entire tragedy. You see the scene unfold with a dreadful sense of foreboding. The small manor is quiet, a temporary sanctuary. Pembroke, believing his charge is secure, rides away to visit his wife, a few miles distant. He has a code of honour, and he trusts in it. He has given his word, and he believes it to be enough. But the world of medieval politics is not one of honour. It is one of ruthlessness and cold calculation. There's a quirky tidbit from the annals of the time that captures the grim humour of the situation. It's said that during his captivity, Gaveston was constantly watched by guards who were forbidden from speaking to him, as the barons feared his legendary charm might sway them. It was a bizarre kind of solitary confinement, a silent psychological torment designed to break his spirit. Historians still argue whether this was a true anecdote or a later embellishment to highlight the barons' fear of Gaveston's influence, but it paints a picture of a man who, even in defeat, was seen as a threat. The silence of the night is shattered by the thunder of hooves. A new party arrives, not in the name of law and order, but in the name of pure, unadulterated vengeance. They are led by the Earl of Warwick, the Black Dog of Arden himself. He had been a part of the alliance that besieged Scarborough, and he had no interest in a legitimate trial. He saw Gaveston not as a man to be judged by the law, but as a pest to be exterminated. He had sworn to get his hands on the man who had mocked him, and he was not about to let a promise of honour stand in his way. The arrival is swift and brutal. Warwick's men storm the manor. Pembroke's guards, shocked and outnumbered, can do nothing. They are sworn to protect Gaveston, but they are now faced with a powerful force that has no intention of following the rules. Warwick's men take Gaveston from his bed, an act of shocking, brazen betrayal. Gaveston knows immediately what this means. His hopes of a trial, of a chance to face the king and plead for his life, have been snatched away. He is now in the hands of the man who had sworn to see him dead. You see the raw terror on Gaveston's face. The arrogance is gone, replaced by a profound, soul-crushing despair. He knows that his end is near. This isn't a legal proceeding. It's a cold, calculated murder. He is a man who had everything, the love of a king and the adoration of a court, and he has now lost it all. He is a captive, a plaything in a brutal game of power, and he is about to become a pawn sacrificed for the greater good of the kingdom, or at least for the satisfaction of its most powerful men. The betrayal is a devastating blow. The Earl of Pembroke, returning to find his charge gone, is consumed with rage and shame. He had given his word, and that word had been broken, not by his enemy, but by his own ally. He is now not just a wronged nobleman, he is a political actor who has been made to look like a fool. This betrayal will have long-lasting consequences, splitting the already fragile baronial alliance and leading to a new wave of political turmoil. The law has been subverted, the code of honour broken, and the stage is set for a climax that will shock the kingdom and change the course of history forever. The scene feels less like a court of justice and more like a grim theatrical performance. You are there, a silent spectator in the cold, unyielding halls of Warwick Castle. The Earl of Warwick, the Black Dog, has Piers Gaveston brought before him. This is not a formal trial with lawyers and a jury. It is a kangaroo court, a political farce designed to give the illusion of justice before a preordained execution. The so-called judges are the most ruthless of the barons, the men who had sworn to see Gaveston dead. There is the Earl of Hereford, a man of grim determination, and the Earl of Arundel, a man known for his brutal efficiency. The law is not on trial here. Vengeance is. The mainstream historical fact is that Piers Gaveston was subjected to a show trial at Warwick Castle, where the Lords Ordainers, without the king's consent, condemned him to death. The barons bypassed all legal procedures, ignoring the Earl of Pembroke's agreement to bring Gaveston to London for a proper trial. They used a twisted interpretation of the ordinances, claiming that since Gaveston had returned to England after being declared an outlaw, he was in violation of the law and therefore subject to immediate execution. It was a legal travesty, a clear demonstration that in this conflict might made right. You see Gaveston, his his face pale and his hands bound, standing before his accusers. He tries to speak, to plead his case, to remind them of the king's affection and his promise of a trial, but they don't listen. They are not interested in his words. They are interested in his death. They recite the charges against him, a litany of his perceived crimes, his arrogance, his influence over the king, his foreign birth, his defiance of the ordinances. The charges are not about law, but about politics, about a power struggle that has now become a matter of life and death. There's a quirky tidbit from the chronicles of the time that speaks to the chilling nature of this trial. It is said that at one point, one of the barons, in a moment of cynical mockery, asked Gaveston if he had any final words. Gaveston, in turn, reportedly said, "I pray for the king, for I am his only true friend." It was a moment of profound sadness, an admission that his love for the king had been both his making and his undoing. Historians still argue about the veracity of this exchange, but it captures the essence of his final moments, a man clinging to the one thing he had left, his devotion to the king. The deliberation is swift and brutal. The barons don't even bother to retire to a separate chamber. They whisper among themselves for a few minutes, their faces grim and set. The decision is made. There is no dissent. Gaveston is found guilty, not of a specific crime, but of being an enemy of the realm. The sentence is death by hanging and beheading, a punishment usually reserved for the most heinous of criminals, but made even more brutal by the additional cruelty that will soon be inflicted upon him. You can feel the air leave the room. The verdict is not a surprise, but its finality is shocking. The man who had once been the most powerful person in England, second only to the king, is now a condemned man. He is a sacrificial lamb, a pawn in a larger game, and his life is about to be forfeit for the sake of political stability. The barons have gotten what they wanted. They have broken the king's spirit and eliminated the source of his defiance. They have restored a sense of order to the kingdom, but they have done so with an act of gross injustice and a blatant disregard for the law. The trial is a chilling reminder of the fragile nature of justice in an age of absolute power. When a king is weak and his nobles are strong, the law can be bent and broken to serve a political purpose. Gaveston's trial was a moment of profound hypocrisy, a stain on the honour of the very men who claim to be restoring order and justice to the kingdom. They have taken the law into their own hands, and they have acted not as judges but as executioners. The stage is now set for the final gruesome act of this tragedy. You stand in the shadows, a ghost at the very heart of the royal court, and you see the Queen in a way you never have before. The news of the Baron's swift, brutal trial of Piers Gaveston has reached London, and the king is a broken man, consumed by grief and impotent rage. He paces his chambers, an open wound of sorrow. But Queen Isabella is not grieving. She is plotting. Her face, usually a mask of quiet suffering, is now a portrait of cold, calculating resolve. She knows the barons have captured Gaveston. She knows they will likely execute him. But she also knows that her own power, her own future, depends on how this story ends. She has a final, crucial move to make. The mainstream historical fact is that while the barons were holding Gaveston captive and conducting their show trial, Queen Isabella was actively using her influence to ensure that the process was not derailed. She wrote letters and sent messengers to key figures, and the content of these messages, while not fully known, was clear in its intent. She was endorsing the barons' actions and was willing to go along with whatever punishment they chose, even death. This wasn't just a tacit agreement. It was a cold, cruel endorsement, a final act of betrayal that sealed Gaveston's fate. Her actions made it clear that she would not be an obstacle to his execution. You see her now, sitting at a table in her private chambers, her ladies-in-waiting whispering in hushed tones as they attend to her. She's not weeping for her husband's lost love. She is not begging for Gaveston's life. She is in fact doing the opposite. She's making it known that she believes the barons are acting in the best interests of the kingdom, and that Gaveston is a threat that must be removed. She's giving them permission, a royal sanction, for an extrajudicial killing. She is the Queen, the mother of the future king, and her word carries weight. Her silent assent is more powerful than 1,000 angry letters from the king. There's a quirky tidbit from the chronicles that speaks to the chilling nature of her ambition. It's said that one of her own servants, a man who was devoted to the Queen, was shocked by her coldness. He reportedly asked her if she had no pity for the man her husband so loved, and she replied, "Pity? What pity did he show me when he took from me all that was mine?" This exchange, if true, shows the depth of her long simmering resentment and her belief that her actions were justified. Historians still argue whether this quote is accurate, but the sentiment behind it is widely accepted as a reflection of her true feelings. She's no longer the passive victim we saw in the early days of her marriage. She's a player, a queen who has found her voice and her power. She's using her political savvy and her deep knowledge of the court to ensure that the Baron's plan goes off without a hitch. She knows that if Gaveston is alive, even as a prisoner, he will be a constant source of strife and a rallying point for the king. She knows that his death is the only way to restore a sense of normalcy, a sense of control to her life and to her kingdom. She is willing to sacrifice one man for her own political survival. Her influence is felt far beyond the confines of her chambers. The barons, emboldened by her tacit support, move forward with their plan. They know that even if the king is furious, he will have a difficult time finding support for a war against men who are seen as restoring order, and who have the public support of the queen. She has created a political smokescreen, a layer of legitimacy that allows the barons to act with impunity. Her endorsement is the final, crucial piece of the puzzle, the permission slip that will allow them to commit an act that is nothing less than murder. The cruel decree is not a written document. It is not a royal order. It is a subtle but unmistakable signal. It is the cold, unwavering stare she gives to those who question the baron's methods. It is the way she turns her back on her husband's pleas for mercy. It is the way she begins to talk about the future of the kingdom, a future that she believes can only begin after the blight of Piers Gaveston has been removed. Her decree is a silent but potent force, and it is the last nail in Piers Gaveston's coffin. She has made her choice, and it is a choice that will forever stain her reputation as a queen and a wife. The journey from Warwick Castle is short but utterly terrifying. You are there, a witness to a final horrifying procession. The condemned man is not on horseback, but is being led on foot, a symbol of his utter humiliation. Piers Gaveston, the man who had once ridden at the king's side in a flurry of silks and jewels, is now a man brought low, a broken figure shuffling toward his end. The day is grim and overcast, a fitting backdrop for the dark act that is about to take place. The location is Blacklow Hill, a small knoll a few miles outside of Warwick, a place that will forever be stained by this act of state-sponsored murder. The mainstream historical fact is that on June 19, 1312, without a trial sanctioned by the king, Piers Gaveston was executed at Blacklow Hill. The execution was an extrajudicial killing, a blatant act of political murder. His captors, the Earls of Warwick and Hereford, along with a number of their allies, decided that a public execution was not enough. The punishment was designed to be not just a death, but a total humiliation of both Gaveston and the king who loved him. It was a message delivered in the most brutal possible terms that the barons would not tolerate any challenges to their authority. You're standing in the small crowd of onlookers, a mix of curious peasants and grim-faced soldiers. There is no town square, no scaffold, no sense of ceremony. This is a private, brutal affair. The barons are not here to put on a show for the public. They are here to fulfill a promise. They have a grim sort of determination etched on their faces, a sense of grim satisfaction that the upstart foreigner who had mocked them for so long is finally about to pay the ultimate price. There's a quirky, almost macabre detail from the chronicles that shows the chilling nature of this event. It's said that when they arrived at the hill, one of the barons presented Gaveston with the final mocking gift of a knife. He was reportedly given a choice, to be hanged like a common criminal or to be beheaded like a nobleman. Gaveston, in a final act of dignity, chose the latter. This chilling anecdote, if true, highlights the calculated cruelty of his captors. Historians still argue whether this final grim courtesy was actually extended to him, or if it was a later embellishment, but it certainly fits the brutal tone of the entire affair. The act itself is swift and merciless. Gaveston is brought to the top of the hill. He is forced to kneel. There is no priest, no last rites, no moment of absolution. He is a man who has been cast out of society and out of God's grace. One of the men, a Welsh soldier in the service of the Earl of Hereford, steps forward. The blow is clean and sharp. The head of Piers Gaveston, the king's favourite, rolls from his body. It is a moment of profound finality, a single act that brings to an end a reign of influence and begins a new era of bloody revenge. But the humiliation is not yet complete. After the beheading, his body is not treated with respect. His headless corpse is left on the hill, an ignominious end for a man who had lived a life of such extravagance and had once been so close to a king. The body remains there for a time, a grim monument to the barons' power and their utter contempt for the king's will. It is a final act of psychological torture aimed at Edward II himself. They are not just killing his friend, they are desecrating his memory, sending a message to the king that his love and his power mean nothing. As you turn away from the scene, the sense of dread is overwhelming. The barons have won. They have removed the source of their discontent. But in doing so, they have committed an act that will irrevocably change the course of history. They have not just killed a man. They have ignited a fire of vengeance in the heart of a king, a fire that will not be quenched until it has consumed them all. The death of Piers Gaveston at Blacklow Hill is not an ending. It is a beginning, a prelude to a civil war that will shake the very foundations of the English monarchy. The news reaches the king not as a whisper, but as a thunderclap. You are there, in a quiet royal chamber, when a breathless messenger, covered in mud and sweat, delivers the grim tidings. The king hears the words Piers, dead, and Blacklow Hill, and something inside him breaks. His face, already pale and drawn from weeks of worry, turns ashen. He doesn't weep or shout. He simply stands there, a statue of pure, unadulterated shock. The love he had felt for his friend, that all-consuming devotion, has been shattered, replaced by a cold, burning rage. The barons had not just killed a man, they had killed the king's spirit, and they had, in a single brutal act, awoken the wrath of a man who had been thought weak and ineffectual. The mainstream historical fact is that Edward II's reaction to Gaveston's murder was one of profound grief that quickly morphed into a furious desire for vengeance. The barons had expected him to be cowed by their display of power, but they had miscalculated. The king was no longer just fighting for his favourite. He was fighting for his own honour, for the principle of royal authority, and for the right to rule without fear of his own nobles. His grief was real, but it was the catalyst for a transformation from a passive, lovesick king into a vengeful monarch determined to punish those who had defied him. You can almost feel the air shift around him. The court, once a place of tension and political manoeuvring, becomes a place of open hostility. The king now sees everyone, even those who had not participated in the murder, as a potential enemy. He looks at his own wife, Queen Isabella, with a new, chilling suspicion. He knows that she did nothing to stop the barons. He knows that her silence was as deadly as their swords. The trust that had been so fragile between them is now completely shattered. The king has been betrayed not just by his subjects, but by his queen. There's a quirky tidbit from the Chronicles that shows the depth of the king's grief and his desire for a kind of twisted justice. It's said that after Gaveston's body was eventually recovered, Edward had it preserved and embalmed, a highly unusual and costly practice, so that he could hold a proper formal state funeral for his beloved friend. This wasn't just an act of piety, it was a public act of defiance, a grand theatrical show of his devotion. He was honouring a man the barons had declared an outlaw, and he was doing it in front of the entire kingdom. Historians still argue whether this was a true act of love or a political statement, but it was certainly an act that left no doubt as to the king's feelings. Edward begins to plot his revenge. He is no longer a man who can be cowed by a simple show of force. He begins to consolidate his power, to find allies among the more moderate barons who were as disgusted as he was by the Earl of Warwick's brazen betrayal. He is a man with a new purpose, a man who will stop at nothing to make the barons pay for what they have done. He offers pardons to men who were loyal to him in the past. He begins to raise an army, not to fight a foreign enemy, but to fight his own subjects. The kingdom is about to descend into a new, more brutal chapter of civil war, a war of revenge that will shake the very foundations of the English monarchy. The barons, for their part, are surprised by the king's fury. They thought they had won. They had removed the source of the kingdom's strife, but they had failed to anticipate the consequences of their actions. They had killed a man, but in doing so they had created a martyr and a king with nothing left to lose. The Earl of Pembroke, who had given his word to protect Gaveston, is now a man shamed and dishonoured by the treachery of his allies. He too is seeking a kind of justice, a kind of retribution for the betrayal of his word. The baronial alliance is already starting to fracture, and the king is waiting, watching, a patient spider in the centre of a web of his own making. The king's rage is not a fleeting thing. It is a slow, methodical, all-consuming fire. He will not rest until the men responsible for Gaveston's death have paid the price. He will not be a passive king anymore. He will be a vengeful monarch, a man who has lost everything and is now determined to make everyone else feel his pain. The death of Piers Gaveston was an act of political expediency, but its consequences will be felt for years, a dark stain on the history of a kingdom and a brutal reminder that love, in the world of power, can be a very dangerous thing. The king's rage is not a fleeting emotion, it's a political engine. The death of Piers Gaveston has not brought peace to the realm, but rather a chilling new era of outright hostility. You are a silent observer in a kingdom that is now openly and violently divided. The fragile peace brokered by the ordinances is shattered. The barons who conspired against the king are now a nervous, splintered group, and the king is a man with a singular bloody purpose to avenge his friend's death. The two sides are now openly preparing for war, a conflict not of grand political ideals but of personal revenge. The mainstream historical fact is that Piers Gaveston's execution led directly to years of armed conflict between Edward II and his most powerful magnates, a period often referred to as the Dispenser War due to the rise of new royal favourites. The king used the barons' extrajudicial murder of his favourite as a pretext to reclaim his authority and punish them for their treason. He began to gather loyalists and raise an army, while the barons, led by the powerful Earl of Lancaster, prepared for the inevitable confrontation. This was not a war of succession or a fight for land. It was a war of vengeance, a tragic consequence of a love affair that had ended in betrayal and murder. You can almost feel the kingdom holding its breath. The king's court is now a place of paranoia and suspicion. Edward II, a man who had once been so trusting and open with his love, is now a cold, calculating monarch. He sees traitors in every shadow. He has a new favourite, Hugh Despenser, a man from a powerful noble family who, along with his father, fills the void left by Gaveston's death. But unlike Gaveston, who was a foreign interloper, the Despensers are English nobles. Their rise to power is not based on love but on political expediency. They are the king's new instruments of revenge, and they are just as reviled by the old barons as Gaveston was, perhaps even more so. There's a quirky tidbit from the annals of the time that speaks to the chilling atmosphere of the court. It's said that the king, in his grief, would often sit in the great hall staring at an empty chair where Gaveston would have sat. He would reportedly refuse to speak to anyone who had been even tangentially involved in the murder of his favourite. This strange, silent protest was his way of letting the court know that he had not forgotten and that he would not forgive. Historians still argue whether this was a true act of melancholic sorrow or a deliberate political performance designed to keep the barons off balance, but it certainly shows the depth of his anger. Meanwhile, the baronial alliance is crumbling. The Earl of Pembroke, who had been shamed by the betrayal of his allies, has switched sides and is now a staunch supporter of the king. He's a man of honour, and he sees the murder of Gaveston as a violation of that honour. He believes that the barons, in their haste for vengeance, have committed an act that is a far greater crime than anything Gaveston ever did. This defection is a major blow to the baronial cause, as Pembroke is a powerful and respected noble. The unified front that had once seemed so invincible is now splintered, a testament to the fact that when men act without honour, their alliances are built on sand. The Earl of Lancaster, on the other hand, is a man who has too much to lose. He had been the ringleader, the man who had orchestrated the murder of Gaveston. He knows that the king's vengeance is aimed squarely at him. He retreats to his lands in the north, gathering his own army, preparing for a civil war that he knows he cannot avoid. He had sought to control the king, and in doing so he had created a monster. He is now a man fighting for his own life and for the survival of his noble house. The queen, Isabella, is caught in the middle. She's a French princess, and the rising power of the Despensers is a threat to her own influence. She had sided with the barons to get rid of Gaveston, but she had never intended to see her husband fall under the influence of a new, even more powerful favourite. She is now an ally to no one, a woman who has gambled on political expediency, and is now finding that the game has a new, unpredictable set of rules. Her political power is once again slipping away, and she is a woman with a new kind of discontent, one that will eventually lead her to a final, tragic betrayal. The kingdom is a powder keg. The king is a man consumed by revenge. The barons are a divided and fearful group, and the queen is a woman with a new set of enemies. The death of Piers Gaveston was supposed to bring peace, but instead it has brought the kingdom to the brink of a new civil war. The blood of the king's favourite has been spilled, and it is a blood that will now be answered with the blood of the men who spilled it. The air is thick with the dust of marching armies and the smell of impending war. You are a ghost on the battlefield, a witness to the clash of two great forces. The king, a man transformed by grief and rage, is now leading an army with a single purpose: to crush his rebellious barons and avenge the death of Piers Gaveston. His chief opponent, the powerful Earl of Lancaster, a man who had once been the most influential figure in the kingdom, is now fighting for his life and his very existence. The Despencer War, a conflict of blood and vengeance, has reached its bloody climax. The mainstream historical fact is that in 1322, after a decade of simmering tensions and armed skirmishes, the forces of King Edward II finally defeated the rebellious barons led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, at the Battle of Boroughbridge. Lancaster's forces were routed and he was captured, a prisoner of the very king he had sought to control. This was not just a military victory, it was a total political reversal, a moment of profound triumph for the king and a brutal end for the man who had ordered Gaveston's murder. You are there, in the midst of the chaos and the clashing of swords, and you see Lancaster, a man who had once seemed invincible, now cornered and defeated. He's a man of immense wealth and power, but he had underestimated the king's newfound resolve and his burning desire for retribution. He had a great cause to rein in a weak king, but he had failed to anticipate the consequences of his actions. He had killed the king's favourite, and now he was about to pay the price. There's a quirky tidbit from the Chronicles that speaks to the grim sense of poetic justice in his defeat. It's said that after his capture, Lancaster was forced to ride a small, broken-down horse, a humiliating contrast to his usual mount, to his final trial. He was reportedly made to wear a tattered cloak, and was mocked by the very peasants he had claimed to represent. Historians still argue whether this was a true anecdote or a later embellishment designed to emphasise the justice of his fall, but it certainly fits the tone of this brutal chapter in English history. Lancaster is brought before the king at his castle in Pontefract. The scene is a grim mirror of the show trial that had condemned Piers Gaveston to death. This time, however, the king is the judge, and the defendant is the man who had killed his friend. The charges are treason, rebellion, and the murder of Piers Gaveston. Lancaster is given no jury, no legal counsel, no chance to defend himself. He is a man condemned before the trial has even begun. The king, in his newfound resolve, is acting with a cold, ruthless efficiency that he had never shown before. The verdict is a foregone conclusion: death by hanging, drawing, and quartering, a truly horrific punishment reserved for the most heinous of traitors. But the king, in a final act of cold, calculated mercy, commutes the sentence to beheading, a punishment more fitting for a man of noble birth. It's a small concession, a final cruel jab at the man who had shown no mercy to his friend. The king is no longer just a man in mourning. He's a man of immense power, a man who will not tolerate any defiance. You witness the final moments of the once powerful Earl of Lancaster. He's brought to a hill outside of Pontefract, the very place where he had once held court. He is made to kneel, and in a final brutal act of vengeance, the head of the man who had engineered the death of Piers Gaveston is severed from his body. The king has gotten his revenge. The blood of his friend has been answered with the blood of his enemy. But this is not an ending. It is a beginning of a new chapter of turmoil and betrayal, one that will not end until the king himself has paid the ultimate price. The victory has been won, but the kingdom is still a powder keg. The Despensers, the king's new favourites, are now more powerful than ever. They are arrogant and greedy, and they are making enemies at every turn. They are alienating the very nobles the king needs to rule, and they are, in their own way, creating the same kind of discontent that had brought down Piers Gaveston. The king has won a battle, but he has not won the war. His victory has been a bloody and brutal affair, and it has alienated the very people he needs to rule. The Queen, a woman who has been sidelined by the king's new favourites, is now watching, waiting for her chance to strike. Her quiet discontent, once again, is beginning to turn into a dangerous weapon. The dust from the Battle of Boroughbridge has settled, but the air is still thick with the scent of blood and betrayal. You are a silent observer, watching as Queen Isabella, a woman once relegated to the sidelines, begins to make her final decisive move. The king, in his triumph, is now completely under the thumb of his new favourites, the Despensers. They are even more greedy and ruthless than Piers Gaveston ever was, and they have alienated every noble in the kingdom. Isabella, a woman who had once allied herself with the barons to get rid of one favourite, now finds herself facing a new, more powerful threat, one that has sidelined her and her son, the young Prince Edward, from the court. The mainstream historical fact is that King Edward II's reliance on the Despensers, coupled with their insatiable greed and arrogance, eventually drove Queen Isabella to abandon her husband and seek refuge in France. She used the pretext of a diplomatic mission to her brother, the new King of France, Charles IV, to flee the increasingly dangerous English court. This was not just a flight, it was a calculated political move, a final public break with a husband who had become a liability and an enemy. She had, in effect, chosen to become a political exile in order to plot his downfall. You see her now, a figure of serene, quiet resolve as she prepares to leave for France. She's not a woman fleeing in terror. She's a woman on a mission. She has seen her husband's weakness, his devotion to his favourites, and his inability to rule. She has seen the kingdom descend into chaos, and she has had enough. She's going to France to find allies, to raise an army, and to return to England not as a queen, but as a liberator. She's going to do what her husband could not. She's going to restore order to the kingdom, and in doing so she will put her son on the throne. There's a quirky tidbit from the annals of the time that shows the depth of her political genius. It's said that while in France she refused to return to England unless the Despensers were removed from power and her son was made regent. Her brother, the King of France, supported her, and the French court became a haven for English exiles who were also plotting against the king. She became a magnet for every disaffected noble, every wronged knight, every person who had been a victim of the Despensers' greed. Historians still argue whether she was acting out of a genuine desire to save the kingdom or a ruthless ambition for her own power, but what's clear is that her actions were a political masterclass. While in France, Isabella falls into a passionate relationship with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English nobleman who was a fierce enemy of the Despensers. Their love affair is not just a personal matter, it's a political alliance. Mortimer is a powerful and charismatic man, a natural leader, and he has a burning desire to return to England and get his revenge on the king and his favourites. Together they form an army, a motley collection of English exiles, French mercenaries, and disgruntled nobles. The stage is now set for a final cataclysmic confrontation. You can almost feel the chill wind of destiny blowing across the English Channel. The king, in his blind confidence, believes that his queen will eventually come to her senses and return home. He believes that the Despensers are his only true friends, and that he has finally defeated his enemies. He is a man utterly divorced from reality, a king who has lost the trust of his people and his own family. He is a king who is about to be betrayed by the very woman he had married to secure a peace. The invasion of England in 1326 is not a large-scale military operation. It is a slow, methodical march of an army that is not seen as an invading force but as a liberating one. The people of England, tired of the Despensers' tyranny, flock to Isabella's banner. The king's support crumbles, his army deserts him. He is a king who has no one left to fight for him. He is a man who has lost everything, and he is about to lose his kingdom as well. The Queen has won. She has used her political cunning, her power, and her new love to engineer the downfall of her husband. Her alliance with Mortimer is a betrayal that is more profound and more devastating than anything the barons had ever done. It is the final, cruel, and tragic end to a love story that began with a man who loved another man and ended with a woman who took everything from him. The stage is now set for the final gruesome act of this tragedy. The stage is no longer a courtly palace, but a dark and treacherous landscape of betrayal and ruin. You are there, a witness to the final act of a king's tragedy. The invasion of England by Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer is not a war but a landslide. The king, once a powerful monarch, is now a man in full flight, his once loyal subjects abandoning him at every turn. He flees to the west, to his remaining castles, but he is a man running from his own shadow. The Despensers, his final desperate allies, are a source of comfort but also a source of his undoing. The mainstream historical fact is that in 1326, following the successful invasion, King Edward II was captured and deposed by his own wife and her allies. He was forced to abdicate in favour of his son, Edward III, a humiliation of the highest order. The very barons he had sought to defeat, and the queen he had so grievously wronged had finally gotten their revenge. This was not just a political defeat, it was a personal annihilation, a complete and total fall from grace for a man who had once been the most powerful person in England. You see the king, his face a mask of despair, as he is brought before Parliament. The very men who had once bowed to him are now his judges. He is accused not of a crime, but of being an unfit king, of having failed his people, and of having been a slave to his favourites. It is a stunning reversal of fortune, a grim and brutal reminder that in the world of power, a king's life can be taken with a single decree. The abdication is a political masterpiece, a way of getting rid of a king without having to shed royal blood. At least, not yet. There's a quirky tidbit from the annals of the time that speaks to the chilling efficiency of his deposition. It's said that the king, in a moment of despair, asked if there was anyone in the room who still had pity on him. The entire room remained silent, a silent, damning indictment of a man who had been so blind to his own follies. Historians still argue whether this moment of profound isolation was a genuine act of cruelty by his enemies, or a later embellishment, but it paints a picture of a king who had finally and utterly been abandoned by everyone. The king is now a prisoner in his own kingdom. He is moved from castle to castle, a grim tour of his former glory. He is a ghost in his own life, a man whose existence is a political liability. The Despensers, his final desperate allies, are captured and executed in the most brutal ways imaginable, their deaths a final gruesome act of vengeance. But the king's fate is not yet sealed. He is a king, and as long as he lives, he is a threat, a rallying point for those who might still be loyal to him. The final tragic act of his life is one of the most gruesome in all of English history. The Queen, with her newfound power, and her lover Mortimer, cannot risk keeping him alive. They need him to disappear. They need his death to be both a political necessity and a final, permanent end to his reign. The whispers of his fate are a source of great debate among historians. One story, a macabre and chilling tale, is so gruesome that it has become the stuff of legend. The legend, a mainstream historical fact, is that Edward II was murdered at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. A red-hot poker, a gruesome instrument of death, was reportedly inserted into his rectum, burning his internal organs without leaving a mark on his body. This was not just a murder, it was a punishment, a grim and final jab at the king's sexuality and his love for Piers Gaveston. It was a symbolic act, a final, brutal humiliation of a king who had lost everything. Historians still debate the veracity of this tale, but the fact of his murder is widely accepted, a dark stain on the reputation of Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer. The king is finally gone. The love affair that had started with such flamboyant joy had ended in a brutal, lonely death. The Queen, in her final act of betrayal, had ensured her husband's demise, and in doing so she had set her own son on the throne. But her triumph would be short-lived. Her own son, Edward III, would eventually turn on her and her lover, having Mortimer executed for treason and having her banished from court. It was a grim and fitting end for a woman who had used love and betrayal as her weapons. And so, we come to the end of our story. A story of a king who loved a man, a queen who was betrayed, and a kingdom that was torn apart by jealousy and revenge. The lives of Piers Gaveston, King Edward II, and Queen Isabella are a testament to the fact that in the world of power and politics, love can be a fatal flaw, and revenge is a slow, methodical poison that can consume everyone in its path. The echoes of their story, of a king who loved too much and a queen who had nothing to lose, still resonate in the cold stone walls of English castles. The gentle hum of the fan, the soft glow of the screen, everything around you is calming. Let the images fade, the roar of the angry barons, the clang of the siege engines, the terrible, final moments on Blacklow Hill. All of it is just a story now. The figures in the tapestries of history are at rest, their passions and their fury long since turned to dust. You are safe in your bed, a quiet observer of the long ago. There is no more strife, no more betrayal, just the peaceful rhythm of the night. The stories of kings and queens, of love and loss can be left to their slumber. Now it's your turn. Close your eyes, let your thoughts drift away, and find the quiet calm that awaits you in the darkness. Let the events of the past fade into a distant whisper, and allow yourself to ease into a deep, dreamless sleep.